이렇게 글씨를 쓰는 행위 자체가 되게 아름답다고 느꼈거든요. 그래서 이걸 쓰는 순간을 한번 예술로 만들어 보면 좋겠다 해서 제가 글씨를 원래는 이렇게 책상 위에서 썼다면 어떤 벽면에 세우듯이 마치 춤을 추듯이 그렇게 이제 글씨를 퍼포먼스 공연으로 한번 해볼까 해서 이렇게 시작하게 된 것 같아요. 외국인 분들도 이걸 뜻을 알지 못해도 되게 아름답다고 느끼시고 예쁘게 봐주시는 것 같더라고요. 여러 기억이 있지만 또 카타르에서의 경험이 되게 기억이 나요. 어떤 분이 이제 보시면서 우시더라고요. 그런 장면들이 어쩌면 저를 계속 이렇게 하게 하는 그런 원동력이 되는 것 같기도 해요. 해외에 나가면 오히려 더 애국심이 생기더라고요. 그래서 세계 시장으로 나가고 싶어요. 공연이 될 수도 있고 교육이 될 수도 있을 것 같아요. 이런 한글을 쓰는 행위 자체가 지금은 사실 손글씨도 잘 안 쓰는 시대지만 오히려 이런 시대일수록 되게 더 가치 있는 일이 될 것 같다고 이제 제가 믿거든요. 그리고 제가 그런 역할을 할 수 있으면 되게 좋을 것 같아요.
Global heritage will unite. We share brilliant values and honor the world's most cherished legacies to pass our heritage on to future generations. Busan invites you, the 48th session of UNESCO World Heritage Committee, July 2026, Busan, Korea.
In our headlines on this Tuesday, January 27th, here in South Korea. In a social media post on Monday, US President Donald Trump says he's raising his tariff on South Korea to 25%, citing failure by the legislature here to promptly approve the bilateral trade deal reached in July and reaffirmed in October. And as expected, Trump's sudden shift in U.S. tariff on South Korean goods into the American market is rattling industries here, including the auto industry, as a significant portion of its sales target the U.S. And the U.S. leader dispatches his border czar Tom Homan to head the immigration enforcement operation in Minneapolis, following talks with Governor Tim Walz amid the shooting death of a second American citizen in the city by ICE agents. It was a hectic morning, to say the least, for South Korea today as government officials, lawmakers and business leaders sought to better understand a social media post by U.S. President Donald Trump announcing a raise in U.S. tariffs on South Korea to 25%. Our correspondent Kim Do-yeon starts us off.
U.S. President Donald Trump said on Tuesday morning, Korea Standard Time, that he was unilaterally reversing a tariff reduction agreement made last July, raising rates on certain South Korean goods from 15% to 25%. Writing on Truth Social, Trump explicitly blamed the National Assembly, stating South Korea's legislature is not living up to its deal. He declared that due to the legislative delay, he was increasing South Korean tariffs on autos, lumber, pharma, and all other reciprocal tariffs. Under the agreement, Seoul pledged a $350 billion investment package, but the initial $20 billion installment has stalled. With the large amount of investment agreed, the Assembly has proposed a special bill for this investment but has not made progress since the proposal, with no passage in sight for now. The Truth Social post wasn't the first warning, it turns out. Local media reported that just 2 weeks ago, U.S. Charge of Affairs James Heller sent a formal letter to Deputy Prime Minister for Science Bae Kyung-hun demanding Seoul honor the joint fact sheet signed last year. This also comes as just last week, South Korea's finance minister told Reuters not a lot of investment can be made under the current foreign exchange situation, at least for this year. Experts see this as one of the triggering factors for the timing, especially with the U.S. Supreme Court's decision on Trump's tariffs coming up.
Trump argues that if the Supreme Court rules the tariffs unconstitutional, the U.S. would be forced to issue massive refunds to trading partners like Japan and Europe. This is not just the tariffs imposed, but also the investment packages, and it's a scenario he claims would be economically damaging.
Amid rising tensions with European nations over Greenland and the U.S. continued push and pull with Canada, Trump is also likely using Korea to send a warning message to other partners.
I believe there is a significant aspect of sending a signal to other countries as well. It conveys the message we are watching and warns them to implement terms faithfully and swiftly.
There is also a political dimension. Facing headwinds ahead of the midterms, particularly regarding immigration controversies in Minnesota, President Trump may be seeking a political win. However, analysts caution that this is likely a secondary factor compared to the stalled trade deal. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Well, Cheongwade, for its part, says it remains committed to its trade deal with the U.S. and will respond, quote, calmly to the latest remarks on tariffs by the U.S. leader. Our correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
U.S. President Donald Trump's unexpected social media message on Tuesday morning scrambled a response meeting at the top office in Seoul. After the meeting led by Chief of Staff for Policy Kim Yong-bum and National Security Advisor Ri Song-nak, the Blue House said in a readout that the government will relay its commitment to carry out the Korea-U.S. trade deal while responding to the renewed tariff uncertainty in a calm manner. It noted that tariff policy officially takes effect only after administrative actions are taken, such as a Federal Register notice. The office seems to be studying what's behind Trump's message, insisting on raising auto and reciprocal tariffs on South Korea to 25%, up from the 15% agreed on under the Allies trade deal. Trump wrote that Korea's legislature was not living up to the deal, but it's unclear whether he's complaining solely because of the legislative process or if there are other reasons beneath the surface. Tuesday's meeting centered on examining follow-up measures to the Special Act on Managing Strategic Investment between Korea and the U.S., which is now being reviewed at the National Assembly. For close communication with Washington, Industry Minister Kim Jong-kwon, who's now in Canada for a business trip, will fly to the U.S. as soon as possible to meet Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Trade Minister Yo Han-gu will also travel to Washington soon to meet his U.S. counterpart, Jamieson Greer. The meeting was attended by the trade minister as well as senior officials from the finance and foreign affairs ministries. Chief of Staff Kang Hoon-sik and the industry minister remotely joined the meeting from Canada. Watchers expect the top office to refrain from immediately responding to the Trump-style unpredictability, but rather closely watch the situation in a calm manner, as the office noted. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
And the National Assembly has been quick to respond to Mr. Trump's social post of a U.S. tariff hike on South Korea. The ruling Democratic Party emphasized that the bilateral trade deal did not include a deadline for parliamentary approval. It pointed out that the deal was based on the introduction of legislation rather than a complete ratification, while adding that 5 bills related to Korea U.S. investments are pending at the relevant standing committee. In sharp contrast, the opposition People Power Party found fault with the Lee Jae-myung administration, arguing that it had failed to address the need for parliamentary approval of the trade deal. It also called for an emergency parliamentary probe into the matter. And while Mr. Trump's intentions behind his call for a higher 25% tariff rate on South Korea remain unclear, their potential impact on markets here, especially that of cars, appears very clear. Our Park Chun-han explains.
U.S. President Donald Trump's plan to raise tariffs on South Korean imports from 15% back to 25% could impact Korea's major export sectors, such as automobiles. For South Korean auto giants Hyundai Motor Company and Kia Motors, the U.S. is a crucial market. In 2025, Hyundai, Kia, GM Korea, and Renault Korea exported nearly 1.65 million vehicles to North America, with Hyundai and Kia alone shipping over 1.19 million. Credit rating agencies and securities firms in Korea estimate that a 10% difference in tariffs could result in at least 3.1 to 4.4 trillion Korean won, or about 2.14 to 3 trillion US dollars in earnings losses for Hyundai Motor Group, which includes Kia Motors. In fact, the two companies already absorbed about 4.6 trillion won in losses during the second and third quarters of 2025 due to high tariffs, despite achieving record U.S. sales of over 1.83 million cars and a market share high of 11.3%. A sudden jump in tariffs would inevitably create major disruptions in sales planning and uncertainty. Moreover, if automakers pass the higher tariffs on to consumers, Korean cars could lose price competitiveness against major auto exporters such as Japan. Although the tariff news overnight shocked the local markets with them opening below Monday's close, the Kospi on Tuesday closed above 5,000 for the first time in history due to a sharp rise in semiconductor stocks, which are exempt from the tariff increases. Park Jun-han, Arirang News.
In other news, South Korea has inked 6 memorandums of understanding with Canadian companies as part of its bid for the Canadian Petroleum Submarine project, valued at 60 trillion won. According to the Trade Ministry, on this Tuesday, the MOUs were signed during an industrial cooperation forum in Toronto on Monday, local time. The two sides touched upon partnership in future mobility sectors and sealed MOUs covering key sectors, including defense, steel, artificial intelligence, and rare earths. The meeting came as Canada weighs specific options, including technology transfer, as potential conditions in its submarine procurement. North Korea launched an unidentified projectile toward the East Sea on this Tuesday, according to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Authorities are analyzing the projectile's specifications, including flight range. Japan's defense ministry also announced that the regime had launched objects believed to be projectiles, which fell outside Japan's exclusive economic zone. If this is confirmed to be a ballistic missile, it would mark the first in 23 days and the second launch this year. The regime previously fired missiles toward the EC on January 4th. And Japanese Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi appears to have called North Korea a nuclear-armed state. Speaking on a TV Asahi News program on Monday, Takaichi touched upon Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its close ties with China, as well as the strengthened relations with North Korea. Calling all three nuclear-armed states, she claimed Japan must reinforce its diplomatic efforts as it faces these states across its border. U.S. President Donald Trump is reshuffling the leadership of his immigration crackdown in the city of Minneapolis following the second fatal shooting of an American citizen there by ICE agents. Our An Sung-jin has the latest.
U.S. President Donald Trump stated that he will dispatch White House border czar Tom Homan to Minnesota. This comes as tensions escalate following the killing of 2 people during protests against federal immigration raids. On his social media, Truth Social, on Monday, Trump wrote that he will be sending Homan to Minnesota, adding that he knows and likes many of the people there, and that he will report directly to Trump himself. Homan oversees border security and immigration enforcement. Trump's decision to dispatch Homan follows criticism of the enforcement tactics used by Greg Bovino, the U.S. Border Patrol chief leading immigration operations in Minnesota. According to sources from AP, Bovino and some agents are expected to leave Minneapolis as early as Tuesday. This comes after Alex Preddy was shot dead by a Border Patrol agent in Minneapolis the day before. Federal authorities described Preddy as an armed agitator, though witness accounts show Preddy was holding a phone.
Nobody in the White House, including President Trump, wants to see people getting hurt or killed in America's streets. Saturday's shooting remains under active investigation by Homeland Security Investigations and the FBI.
During the same press briefing, Leavitt stated that Trump talked with Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who has been critical about the administration's immigration enforcement policies. The two allegedly had a very good conversation and appear to share similar thoughts and perspectives. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
Over in the Middle East, the first phase of the peace plan between Israel and Hamas has come to a promising end, with the return of the remains of the last hostage paving the path for transition into phase 2. Our Lee Seung-jae has details.
The Israeli military said Monday that it had retrieved the body of the last remaining Israeli hostage in Gaza. The body is that of Master Sergeant Ron Gavili, who had been missing since the war began and was the final unresolved hostage case under the current ceasefire agreement with Hamas. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the recovery an extraordinary achievement, saying it brings closure to a painful chapter for Israel. The return of Gavili also brought relief for his family members.
Yeah, we feel relief. We came home, and it's the best thing that happened to us. Thank you very much.
The military said it began searching a cemetery near Gaza City early Sunday after intelligence was clarified over the weekend. A senior military official said the cemetery was located near the so-called Yellow Line, an area still under Israeli control under the ceasefire terms. Hamas's armed wing said it had provided mediators with detailed information about Gavili's location, allowing Israeli forces to narrow their search. Hamas spokesman Hazam Qassem said the discovery confirms the group's commitment to fulfilling the ceasefire agreement, adding that Hamas continued to update mediators until the remains were recovered. President Trump also confirmed Hamas's involvement. In an interview with Axios on Monday, Trump said the search and identification of the body was extremely difficult and that Hamas made a significant effort alongside Israel to determine the location of the remains. He called on Hamas to now follow through on its commitment to disarm. Meanwhile, Israel says it will reopen the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt in a limited capacity later this week. Officials say the reopening of the crossing and the return of Gavili's body were the final major hurdles in phase 1 of Trump's plan. Attention can now fully turn to the second phase, which involves demilitarizing Gaza and establishing a new governing authority and security force for the territory. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
As Korea and France celebrate 140 years of friendship this year, we'll sit down with the French organizer of a similar celebration 10 years ago for her thoughts on bilateral cultural exchanges back then and now. Foreign Affairs correspondent Oh Soo-young files this report.
A new year of discovery is unfolding in France as cultural exchange with Korea hits new dimensions. As Seoul and Paris mark 140 years of diplomatic relations in 2026, scores of exhibitions, performances and exchanges will highlight both classic and contemporary culture. For years, director Agnès Benayer has been the driving force of bilateral cultural ties. She was the chief authority in charge of the 130th anniversary celebration. Collaborations have since broadened well beyond film. Benayer says the two nations are kindred creative spirits.
I think Korea is a rare country where art is truly reinvented, creativity revisited, while remaining deeply rooted in tradition and culture. France and Korea share this passion for a millennia-old culture that is very open to the future, not afraid to evolve, and enriched by cross-cultural blending.
Through the common language of heritage and innovation, various art exchanges are flourishing.
In France, I believe what works first and foremost is when events create bridges between the two cultures through dialogue. When we presented the creation by José Montalvo with the National Ballet, it produced something very beautiful, very unprecedented. More recently, Kim Soo-jae's installation at the Bourse de Commerce was magnificent, especially her mirror work in the rotunda. And the French have a great curiosity for craft, for Korean design, Korean culture in general, from hanbok to knot-making traditions. We have come to love and continue to discover many things about Korea. There's curiosity about Korean heritage, civilizations we know little about, whether the kingdom of Shilla or Joseon.
Cooperation continues between leading national museums, and the Pompidou Art Centre's Seoul branch opening this year is highly significant, she says. Benayer was a former director at the prestigious Paris-based institute.
It shows that Korea has become a central place for contemporary art. 10 years ago, that was less the case. But there is an important art market in Korea now. The presence of Pompidou testifies to that.
Today, the director oversees partnerships across 14 Paris museums, handling over 1 million works. The Sanusi Museum alone holds nearly 250 Korean works. It will highlight Korea this year through exhibitions on contemporary art and Joseon literature. More broadly, Benayer is keen to see partnerships blossom across new realms, in particular digital art.
There will be a virtual reality exhibition created by the Musée d'Orsay around the Impressionists. Also, a first online webtoon festival. We're seeing new artist residencies too. The Villa Busan is dedicated to visual arts. In 2026, we will open the Villa Bucheon, dedicated to graphic arts.
This compares to a decade ago, when Korean culture was mostly unknown across France. Benayer launched nearly 500 events in both countries on the 130th anniversary, drawing almost 7 million visitors.
It was a deeply enriching experience. We hoped then to foster cooperation between institutions for sustainable collaboration. And it's happening. For 10 years now, Korea has continued to captivate the French public from K-dramas such as Squid Game to K-pop, K-food, and K-beauty. More recently, many French people discovered K-literature through Han Gang's Nobel Prize. These dimensions already existed 10 years ago, but only a few recognized it. For us, we could see Hallyu would continue to evolve. That is a great strength of Korean culture.
Under the theme Creativity, Opportunities, Solidarity, over 100 programs across 20 cities will take place in both countries throughout 2026. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News, Paris.
This is The World Now, bringing you everything you need to know from around the globe.
A ferry sank off the southern Philippines early on Monday, killing at least 18 people. Philippine Coast Guard officials report the ship carrying more than 350 passengers encountered technical trouble and tilted over before taking on water near Basilan Island. Rescuers pulled 317 survivors to safety and recovered 18 bodies. Navy ships and aircraft are searching for roughly 24 believed to be missing. Authorities have launched a full investigation to determine the exact cause of the disaster. Gunmen in Mexico's central Guanajuato state killed 11 people and injured 12 others on Sunday following a soccer match. According to authorities, the armed attackers opened fire on a post-game gathering in the city of Salamanca. Salamanca's mayor said the motive was not immediately clear and called the attack cowardly, adding that a woman and a child were among the injured. The state attorney general's office promised a thorough investigation. State police have reinforced security across the area as they hunt for the perpetrators responsible for the attack. The European Union has launched a formal investigation into social media platform X following reports that its AI tool Grok had generated non-consensual sexualized deepfake images. Brussels said it will examine whether X met obligations under the Digital Services Act to limit illegal content risks, including manipulated sexually explicit images that could amount to child sexual abuse material. Regulators also widened an existing probe into X's recommendation systems after the platform said it would use Grok to help decide which posts users see. Chu Ji-hyun, Arirang News.
A blast of freezing air is moving in from the north this afternoon, and chill winds are getting stronger. Cold wave warnings are now in place for northern Gyeonggi-do, Gangwon-do, and parts of northern Chungcheongbuk-do and Gyeongsang-buk-do provinces. Cold wave advisories have also been expanded around central areas and parts of Gyeongsang-buk-do province. However, it's going to get even colder as we head toward the end of this week. In Seoul, morning temperatures will plummet to around -10 degrees Celsius tomorrow and Thursday, and could fall as low as -12 degrees on Friday. Other areas will have a cold morning tomorrow, with Chuncheon at -14 degrees, Daejeon at -9 degrees. Highs will rise only to -2 degrees in Seoul, 3 degrees in Gwangju, Daegu, and Gyeongju. In addition, dry weather warnings are in place along the East Coast, with advisories covering the Seoul metropolitan area and much of the eastern regions. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
Those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. As always, thank you for watching.
Right now, the new shopping game is starting.
country where traditional and modern cultures coexist.
Where you can explore spectacular landscapes and nature.
Savor the delights of traveling at every turn.
Where? Korea, of course.
There are some must-visit places in Korea. Ones that appear in every tour guidebook: Hangang River, Gyeongbokgung Palace from the Joseon Dynasty, and
Yes, these are essentials, but I want to go somewhere a little different. I don't have to follow the guidebook. For example, filming locations for K-pop music videos or K-dramas and movies.
traveling is all about taking it slow. A long walk at your own pace, or even zoning out somewhere quiet. Doesn't it sound relaxing?
You travel for the experience, trying something new in a foreign place, de-stressing and making lifetime memories, taking tons of pictures along the way.
70% of the Korean territory is mountainous. Naturally, hiking is a very popular pastime in Korea. Not your kind of activity? Trust me, the view will make the effort worth it. Just catch your breath by the cold stream in the valley.
Korea is surrounded by the sea on three sides. From the beach, you can enjoy a wide open view, as well as various water activities. But the riverside is great too. There's plenty to see and do.
If you're in Korea, you can't miss the night view full of dazzling lights.
Yes, even the same place can have a totally different vibe at night.
Want to make unforgettable memories?
How about traveling to all corners of Korea? Join us next time to explore more about Korean culture.
The Pentagon's new defense strategy calls on U.S. allies, including South Korea, to strengthen their own security as the Trump administration places priority on its homeland. Welcome to Press Perspective for this Tuesday, January 27th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. The main responsibility of deterring North Korea will lie with South Korea as the U.S. offers critical but more limited support. Now, this is according to the U.S. National Defense Strategy released by the Pentagon under the Trump administration. For more on the implications of this new defense document by the U.S., I have Rui Valdez with Spanish news agency EFE Spain here in the studio. Rui, welcome back.
Nice to be here, Sun-hee.
I also have Professor Che Hyun-jin at Kyunghee University joining our talk virtually. Professor Che, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Right, we shall start here in the studio. Rui, let's begin with details with regard to security here on the Korean Peninsula as outlined by the Pentagon under the second Trump administration.
Right, with the Pentagon's new defense strategy, South Korea seems to, or it seems that it's going to take the driver's seat on their defense while the U.S. narrows its role in it. The interesting question that arises is how much will they narrow this role in Korea and other things related to Pyongyang. But let's start with number one. This doesn't mean that Washington is walking away, and it's quite... Well, I wouldn't say it's 100% clear, but at least there's a strong signals that they will keep nuclear deterrence, which means that they will keep this nuclear umbrella over South Korea in case there's some kind of attack or war. But the U.S. role now is framed as critical but more limited. And this is in the context of two things. Since long time ago, even before the current administration, South Korea wants to take control of the operational control in wartime, what is called the OPCON. Lee Jae-myung, the current president, has promised that he will get that control during this term. So it is not surprised that in that sense, U.S. is saying, yeah, we will give you this protagonism by this transfer, potentially. But it's also a complex topic in a way that this promise has been made before by other administrations and still haven't been done because the U.S. arguably says that South Korea is not ready for the transfer after doing certain tests, etc., etc. This is all in line also with other topics like the administration of Donald Trump asking other countries to raise their defense spending, to take a higher burden of the cost of maintaining U.S. troops in their respective countries, things that South Korea has committed to do. And there is this one thing that, of course, everybody's pointing out, that is that denuclearization of the peninsula is not mentioned in the document. And this happens right after the National Defense Strategy also didn't mention the denuclearization of North Korea or the Korean Peninsula, and also after the Nuclear Consultative Group met last year and also didn't mention it in their report, which was a breakthrough. That they didn't mention this part. So there are many interpretations about this. Some are just saying that U.S. is trying to say we are not going to prioritize North Korea as much as before. Others are saying, well, this could be related to the fact that Trump has continuously promised that he will try to meet Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, as soon as possible. And maybe because North Korea says as a condition, it has signaled that if U.S. wants to dialogue with us, denuclearization has to be off the table. So probably it could be taken as a signal, but still we're stretching it a lot in that sense. What is clear is that that topic, at least for U.S. in those documents, is not mentioned, and we will need to see in the future how this get actually applied.
Right, and before we delve deeper into that defense document, I'd just like to ask you about a developing story. The Joint Chiefs of Staff here in South Korea spoke about the launch of an unidentified projectile by North Korea today. What's the latest on that front?
Yes, less than 2 hours ago, the South Korean army detected multiple projectiles that were launched from North Korea to the East Sea. They haven't given much details about them. First they say it was one, now they say it's multiple. But the Japanese authorities also detected the launch and have given a little bit of more signals of what it could be. They say it's potentially ballistic missiles. And Prime Minister Takaichi said that it was two missiles, two apparently ballistic missiles. They don't confirm it, but we could conclude that at least 2 missiles were launched, and the details, well, this is an ongoing news, so probably in the near future we'll get to know more details about it. The last launch that was made by North Korea this year was in the beginning of the month, on 4th of January, when Lee Jae-myung, the president of South Korea, was going to China to meet the leader of their Xi Jinping. So again, there is tension in the peninsula. The context is there's no dialogue between the Koreas for many years already. There's no signals that this will happen again, and this is just another potential message of Pyongyang that they will keep doing their weapons tests and all these type of measures that usually are highly criticized by the international community.
Right, and against this backdrop, Professor Che, as Rui mentioned earlier, I'm going to use his metaphor. The latest defense document by the Pentagon under the second Trump administration seeks to place South Korea in the driver's seat with regard to deterring North Korea. What do you believe are the pros and cons of this strategy for the Lee Jae-myung administration?
Thank you for the question. This new strategy brings both opportunities and also challenges for the Lee Jae-myung administration. And let me start with the more positive side. First, this policy treats South Korea as a strong and a mature security partner. It acknowledges that South Korea has a powerful military and advanced weapon and a high defense budget. And therefore, this policy, this strategy fits very well with the current Lee Jae-myung administration's self-reliance defense policy. And secondly, taking a leading role can give Seoul a more control over its own security decision. So instead of relying fully on Washington, we can shape deterrence on the peninsula more directly. But now let's turn to the more negative side. The biggest worry is about U.S. commitment in a security crisis. When Washington talks about a more limited support, many people in South Korea may naturally ask this question: will U.S. stand by us in times of a crisis? Then another concern is the growing burden on the Korean government. Taking a greater responsibility means higher defense costs and harder policy decision, and also a greater political pressure at home. And this will not be easy for the Lee Jae-myung administration to manage, I think. And also there is also concern about North Korea as well. If the United States focuses more on managing threat rather than denuclearization, the South Korea may face difficult decision about how to deal with Pyongyang. So in general, this new strategy gives Seoul more responsibility and also more independence. But it also requires a very careful coordination with Washington as well.
Right, and that is perhaps why this new strategy by the Pentagon was discussed between officials here and U.S. Under-Secretary of Defense Policy, Elbridge Colby, who was in South Korea. What's the latest on that front with regard to the discussions?
Well, Undersecretary Colby, which is the number 3 in the Pentagon, had a busy schedule yesterday. He had ministerial meetings with Foreign Affairs, Defense, and met also the National Security Advisor. He appeared in a forum where he outlined the alliance modernization, the burden sharing. He also has scheduled a visit to Camp Humphreys of the USFK, the U.S. forces in South Korea, apparently reinforcing the continuity of those troops here. And he also, by the end of the day, he posted in social media that South Korea was a model ally, something that he repeated a lot, reiterated a lot on all these events, and also showing or commenting that they are meeting that South Korea is meeting the global standard of spending 3.5% of GDP in defense. So this was in general his activities, of course, in the context of this national defense strategy. He did mentioned in the meeting with Foreign Affairs and Defense this new protagonism that South Korea will take according to the new document or the new strategy of the U.S. There is one subject that, well, also ongoing news. We woke up today with something that seems unrelated, but I will show you the connection. Today, President Donald Trump announced that he will reapply higher tariffs on autos and other reciprocal tariffs that he used to apply before they reached last year with Seoul another trade and security agreement. I know I'm talking about tariffs, but this agreement in full, it included also submarine cooperation. This means that U.S., when they were, as part of the negotiation to reduce the tariffs, U.S. approved South Korea to develop or to adopt submarines, nuclear-propelled submarines. And this yesterday was discussed, well, not discussed, even was discussed, but also was, Undersecretary Colby was showing positive signs that, yeah, they were going ahead with this plan and that this will reinforce the alliance. But now with this news, we don't really know how far is this going to get, because until Seoul and U.S. solve that issue, the whole pact that they made last year could be at risk. And there's a Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court pending to approve or to rule to approve or deny the tariffs, which will be a big hit on Trump. And South Korea, we don't really know what's the strategy, but at least it has not approved the plan through the parliament, which means that if South Korea somehow managed to wait or cannot approve this, the Supreme Court of U.S. could refute this agreement, and now we're in a mess that we don't know if even things related to security and defense will be applied under this new pact. So right now, with this new development, we could say that Undersecretary Colby seemed to have these signals that they were gonna go ahead with these plans related to OPCON, related to submarines, etc., everything that we already discussed and Professor Choi also was mentioning in detail. But with this new development, we are all questioning if this is actually gonna follow through.
Right, the uncertainty triggered by Mr. Trump's social media post about raising tariffs on South Korea to 25% from 15%. Professor Choi, I'd like to take your attention to something that Rui said earlier. He pointed out that this defense strategy by the Pentagon makes no mention of denuclearization. What are your thoughts regarding this particular omission?
I think this omission is not accidental. Therefore, it should be read very carefully. I believe this is intentional. By leaving out the word, the denuclearization, Washington is showing a more realistic view of today's security situation. In other words, the U.S. does not expect North Korea to give up its nuclear weapon anytime soon. So instead, it is putting more weight on deterrence and stability in the Korean Peninsula. And secondly, and what is the purpose of this choice? So I think by not using strong and fixed language such as denuclearization, the United States is keeping its foreign policy more flexible, and therefore is trying to avoid locking itself into goals that are not really achievable. And finally, this is an important question. Can this create a better environment for talks between Washington and Pyongyang? In some ways, yes. In general, a softer voice and public position and a softer language choice can make dialogue less tense and also more probable. And also it can create more space for step-by-step talks with Pyongyang. But there is also a clear downside as well. North Korea may see this silence as a sign that Washington is quietly accepting its nuclear power status. And that could weaken the global pressure on Pyongyang, and it can raise concern here in South Korea. So in general, this omission is showing a clear shift from ideal goal to practical risk management, and it gives Washington a more room to negotiate and also more opportunity to manage tension. But at the same time, it also requires very close coordination with Seoul to avoid sending the wrong message to North Korea.
Right. Ruin, not only does the Pentagon omit denuclearization, the Pentagon latest document, defense document, omit North Korea's denuclearization, it also makes no mention of Taiwan. And according to foreign media, it also reportedly downplays the threat posed by China. Could you first begin by telling us a bit about what has been shared about China and what appear to be the broader implications of this new stance by the Pentagon with regard to defense?
Of course, China faded from center stage in this new defense strategy, which was also has not been heard in a long time. If you compare it with the strategy during the administration of Joe Biden, China was labeled as a pacing challenge and threat to U.S. security. And now the shift goes, of course, not mentioning anything similar and saying that Beijing will be approached through strength and not confrontation. And the document makes emphasis on strategic stability, de-escalation, and denial defense instead of containments. This new approach is very much in line with what Professor Choi was mentioning related to North Korea. U.S. wants to have this strategy more in line with the America First, let's say, view of the administration of Donald Trump, in the sense that they want more flexibility on negotiations. They don't want to be now acting like the police of the world, the police of that region, in the greatest scale that they used to do, allegedly at least. And this now is approaching China through a way where it seems that they are open more about negotiation instead of them setting the pace or how things have to be done in the region. Regarding Taiwan, yeah, it caught the attention, just as denuclearization was not mentioned, that Taiwan was also not mentioned in comparison to previous national defense strategy. I was talking to colleagues of Taiwan journalists, and they were telling me that actually that particular part was not as big news in Taiwan. Something that surprised me, of course, well, that's not the area I cover, but I thought that was going to be a major concern or be interpreted as U.S. abandoning or signaling that they will reduce protection on the region. But they were telling me that they focus more on the actual actions, and when it's related to the documents, it doesn't actually caught their attention as much. Well, this is, I'm quoting somebody, I don't know exactly the reaction there in the territory, but at least it seems that they were not worried excessively about this. Being that said, it still is another signal of everything that we have discussed, of this new approach that the U.S. is taking, and that now they will have a diplomatic flexibility with Beijing even in these matters. Recently, also, there was some big news in China where Xi Jinping was made, practically fired, the number 2 and number 3 of the military committee. There's no evidence right now that this is related with all these things or shifts that are happening, but of course it's a big issue that also could signal that there's going to be a new approach from China in these matters. So again, let's take it as for now, until we have more information, as a signal of this new approach of the U.S. No, it's not an abandonment of the region. It doesn't mean that they will leave Taiwan to China, but it's more about how they will approach these problems, more in this flexibility or diplomatic flexibility that Professor Cho was mentioning.
Right then. Professor, with regard to Russia, though, this U.S. defense paper claims Moscow, and I'm quoting, remains a persistent but manageable threat to NATO's eastern members. How does this stance look to affect future peace talks for Ukraine, do you think?
Yes, this wording is important. By calling Russia a persistent but manageable threat, the US is saying that Russia is a serious problem, but not the one that must be destroyed. In other words, the Washington sees Russia as a challenge, but this challenge can be kept under control. But Russia is not an enemy that must be defeated. So what does it mean for peace talk on Ukraine? First, I think it can make peace talks more possible. If the U.S. believes that the war can be contained, it may be more open to negotiation that can stop the fighting and also reduce damage to Ukrainian people. And this language also helps lower tension in Ukraine, and it signals that the goal is stability, not endless escalation. But however, there's also a negative side as well. The Ukraine may worry that this approach could lead to less pressure on Russia, and Ukraine may also fear that its partners, such as NATO and the United States, will focus more on stability rather than restoring and protecting its own sovereignty and also independence. And for Europe, this stance also means greater responsibility. If the United States takes a more balanced approach between other Western Europe and also Russia, that means European countries may need to do more in supporting Ukraine and also protecting themselves. So overall, this U.S. position is creating more realistic environment for peace talk, but it also raises a difficult question. The peace talks may become easier to start, but it could require very hard compromise. The key issue here is whether Ukraine can remain as an equal partner and equal voice in any future peace negotiation. My personal opinion to this question is negative.
Professor Che, let's end then with a question with regard to South Korea. So as the U.S. seeks to place its priority on homeland security, what are your suggestions for South Korea to bolster its own security here in this part of the world? Very briefly speaking.
Yeah, the first one is our priority is always deterrence. The North Korea must believe that if we start a war, the cost will be immediate and overwhelming. The words alone are not enough, and this kind of belief is coming from real conventional power, and therefore we need a more and continued investment in their conventional strike force, such as a Hyunmoo-5 ballistic missile and also next generation air power, such as F-35K fighter. And at the same time, strong self-defense does not mean acting alone. The South Korea must maintain a strong alliance with the United States. So the goal is not to choose between alliance and autonomy. The goal is both. So we must aim for strong self-defense and at the same time, strong teamwork with the United States.
Right, a balance then between the two. All right, Professor Che, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
And we're here in the studio. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you, Sanghi.
Right, on that note, we end this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.